Thanks, Juan.
Cool. Thanks, Tom. So hey, everybody. Today, I want to talk a little bit about kind of my strategy or strategies for building React apps in an opinionated manner, and kind of why we want to do that, or at least I've wanted to do that. So this is called avoiding the giant spaghetti single page application monster. So hopefully you'll find this helpful. Here we go. So about me, my name is Juan Fabrega. I'm a software engineer at Palmetto Solar. We are hiring if anybody's interested in anything like that. So just go to the website and see what's going on over there. I'm also going to post all of this entire presentation up on GitHub after the talk. It's all actually made with Markdown, so it should be pretty easy for anybody to take a look at. So some things I've worked on. So currently I'm the core maintainer for the Palmetto component library, which is a React kind of design system component library, as well as our token library, which powers the component library. And then previously I worked at a local company here, Rhinogram, maintaining that component library called Rhino-Style. So these are both open source projects actually. So you can whenever you have a chance, you go take a look at what those look like. So why did I want to give this talk? So the main reason I think is like for me everything is UX, and I work in UX pretty much all day. I build component libraries, so it's both UX in terms of the interfaces that get built out of those components, but also the consumers themselves, which are other developers, and their experience with what we're building for them. And I think one of the key things I've noticed, I don't strictly just work on component libraries. I also contribute a lot to our private applications. I can't share those because they're not open source. But one of the things that I've noticed over the years is that one of the key contributors to developer productivity is consistency in the code base. And for me, I always relate back because I have a product background, and so I used to be a lot into the UX side of things, and I always relate everything to this book, which I really like, by Steve Krug, called Don't Make Me Think. And one of the things he says is, doesn't matter how many times I have to click, as long as each click is a mindless, unambiguous choice. So in the same way, I feel like when I'm a developer for a team, it is a pain point when I have to think about how to solve a problem. And not necessarily about problems that we haven't solved before, or challenges with creating a feature itself, but more of the meta of solving a problem. So for example, things that I don't want to think about. So the goal should be not to eliminate thinking altogether, like in the book Don't Make Me Think, but to eliminate time spent on things that are inconsequential to think about. So what are these things that I'm talking about? So which directory does this file belong in? Like, I never want to have to think about that ever. Does this data belong in the global store or a state management? I never want to have to think about that. Like, I want all that stuff to be defined for me at some point where I can just start building and doing what I want to do. And it doesn't necessarily matter if there's boilerplate along with that. I would rather have the boilerplate, but know that I need to do it, versus don't know what my next step is when I'm starting to build something. Should I create a CSS class or just some inline styles? Again, I never want to have to ask this question ever in a code base. I want to know exactly how we style things as a team and just get it done. So what are some questions that I do want to ask, test possible scenarios correctly for this feature? That's something that's very hard to, I think, to create patterns for. But it's something that I want developers to spend their time thinking, not necessarily some of the other inconsequential things. So does the solution provide the best user experience? Again, this is a valid question that I want people asking themselves. And there's not really a clear-cut answer. But again, it's about having developers spend the time on the right things for me. So how is this relevant to React? So the reason why I came up with this idea for the talk is because I feel that React is one of the least opinionated frameworks or libraries, before anybody tries to kill me over that. But even comparing it with something that's relatively flexible like Vue, as you can see here, there's a lot of places where you have to make some choices, right? So for example, routing, Vue has like a specific component maintained by the core team, or sorry, a package maintained by the core team, which is Vue Router. In React, you have lots of ones, and I actually, that's not a typo. The reason I put React Router there twice is because every time they change to a new major version, it's a completely new API. So, so same thing with global state. Vue has Vuex, which is again maintained by the official core team. React does not have a state management library to go along with it, although unofficially I would say it's probably Redux, although there's MobX and Recoil as well. In terms of building components, with Vue, you'll most likely 99% of the time be doing single file components. In React, you could be doing functional components, class components, and then also who knows where the styles are going to go, because that's very much all over the place in React apps. Local state, with Vue, I like to say it's magic. Obviously, it's not, but it's kind of close to magic. It's kind of it's just binding variables to a data object. And with React, you have things like hooks and set state if you're doing classes. So there's some discrepancy there in terms of how you want to approach something. And then something like scoped styles, which I think a lot of people find helpful. It comes out of the box in Vue. So you have scoping out of the box with single file components. And in React, you have to reach for a library, something like CSS modules or styled components or anything of that nature. So again, you start to see this pattern of, hey, I have to make a lot of choices for my React code base. Not to say that you absolutely need all of these things, but most large scale applications will have a version of one of these patterns implemented, and you do have to make those choices no matter what. Cool. So so again, the goal is to reduce kind of the friction of thinking about these things. And I think the natural question is, where do we start? So first of all, I think a prerequisite to all of this is there has to be management or product buy-in at any company that you work at in regards to doing work that is perceived as not creating direct value for the company. So in other words, not doing feature work. So I'm not going to talk about that because I feel like that could be a whole talk in and of itself. But for the time being, let's assume that you've got management product buy-in to actually work on your architecture alongside the features that you need to build. So there's a few questions people usually ask themselves. So is this a brand new code base? Is it an existing code base with competing patterns or lacking consistency? And is it an existing code base which is already well architected and consistent? And I think for me, the answer is the same no matter what, which is that you need BDFL. For anybody who's not familiar with this term, BDFL, it stands for Benevolent Dictator for Life. And in this case, obviously, for life is very subjective because most of us work for companies and we probably won't work for those companies for the rest of our lives. But I think that the core concept is very applicable. And the general idea, by the way, this picture is Guido van Rossum, who's the creator of Python and also was its benevolent dictator for, I think, 2 decades or something like that. But the idea behind this person is that they can evaluate what the team needs. Obviously, they consider input from everybody. You know, it's not a dictator in the strictest sense. That's why the benevolent part is very important. But at the end of the day, they do make and enforce decisions that are in essence unilateral, right? After the feedback has been obtained and after a lot of things have been considered, the decisions are unilaterally made by this person. Or in this particular case, I would advocate that you don't necessarily need it to be a single person, but at least a group of people, and hopefully not the entire team, because then it becomes too difficult. So I think to summarize this, I would say that you probably want to elect your benevolent dictator democratically, but then let them rule thereafter. Okay, so next up is some basic process. So for me, the important process portion here is the architecture meeting. So I think it's important as teams to have these and have them on a schedule. Now, the schedule may vary per team and also based on the size and availability of everybody, but in general, they should be on a schedule. I usually recommend something like once a month for an architecture meeting. And the main things you want to be doing in this meeting are identifying any problem areas. So for example, things that you find irritating or just badly implemented about your code base that you want to change. Now, the important part is you don't just change them willy-nilly, right? Like that's the whole idea behind having an opinionated, writing an opinionated application and kind of maintaining a team culture that respects that, is you don't just change something because you want to. So you identify the problem areas in an architecture meeting. You also identify any novel needs. So for example, something that you have not needed until now, but now you do, and you need to figure out the best possible solution to it. You solicit some team feedback. This obviously happens asynchronously, so along the way, not during the meeting, but along the way in the previous weeks or months or however time frame you have, feedback is solicited in terms of the things that are in the backlog for the architecture committee or the dictator. I should probably stop saying dictator. I think that's going to go over well. But and then this committee or this person would evaluate any options and make some decisions. So, and lastly, part which is really important is insert the work into any upcoming sprints, right? Like this is part of the business buy-in. You don't necessarily make much headway by deciding to change something in your architecture, but not having any time slated for your team to perform those changes, or or if it's informal work, it usually doesn't ever get done. So that's where the business buying comes in, and that's why this is a really, really important part, the inserting the work into upcoming sprints, so that the stuff actually can get done in the code base. Hopefully, over time, is improved. Now, in this particular case, I'm talking about a code base that requires that improvement. Obviously, if it's a brand new code base, then you probably stop at the making decisions part and you start implementing things. Okay, so next up, documentation. So I think that as part of this effort, there should be more to your README than, hey, just run yarn start and run the application, and that's it. That's all you need to know. Which is what I typically see in a lot of code bases, which obviously is like boilerplate from Create React App or something, and it was just left there forever and ever. So what I usually recommend is some sort of contribution guide or style guide for the code base itself. And I've actually provided an example here of the one that we have currently for the Palmetto Components open source project. Take a look at it. I'm not through the whole thing, but just to give everybody an idea. So contribution guide for our code base. And so first of all, table of contents, a whole primer on how to develop locally, any guiding principles. So for example, how we view desktop on mobile support, cross-browser accessibility, basically all the things we feel are important for people to have kind of in the context in the back of their minds while they're working on something. So, and then also just a very quick, hey, how do you build a component, right? So this is what the component folder would look like. And these are all of the things that you want to have in your component folder, and each of them has a specific purpose, right? So in things like syntax, for example, this is how you define our type interface. This is the syntax that we want. These are the things that we expect of you. So something like this or akin to this, I think, is just incredibly helpful for any team. And I'll get to that more in just a little bit in terms of how this, I think, gets ingrained into the culture eventually, right? You don't necessarily need to have it as a reference pulled up every time you're working on something, because eventually, it's assimilated into the culture of the team. But it's mostly for new team members coming in who have never worked on a code base before, haven't spent a week going through these and just kind of assimilating all this stuff. Oh, and there was bullets here that I forgot about. But anyway, this is what I recommend people include in their contribution guide, or you can just put it in the README too. That doesn't need to be a separate document if you don't want to. Cool. So next up is culture. I think it's important that the team understands the added value of the good code base UX, right? So that should be really kind of one of the top items on the agenda is, hey, let's make sure that we all know that this is providing value. And it can be difficult because the truth is that not everybody's going to like everything about the code base, right? And that's okay. I think that that's always okay. So, for example, I don't like some of the things that we do in our own code bases that I actually even put in that contributing guide, but I found them to be good compromises to some of the needs that other team members had. And I prefer the consistency over just getting my way all the time. So that's what we did. So anyway, code reviews, I think, should include a style review. So obviously, when you do a code review, the more important thing is, does the code work? Does it work well? Does it perform well? Obviously, that's what you want to look for, so you don't introduce bugs into your code base or into your product. But I also think that they should include a style review. And I think a lot of people bristle at this idea because it makes code reviews seem superficial. What I would say is that typically happens because because a lot of reviewers do that based on their own opinions. So if you get a code review that's all style based on the reviewer's opinion, it's not worth a whole lot because everybody's opinion is different, and you still end up with a code base that's kind of messy based on the reviewer of that pull request. So what I would advocate is, hey, have there be a style review with every code review, but that style review should be completely based on the guide that you've already laid out. So it shouldn't be, hey, I prefer things to be broken out this way, or I prefer to have imports done this way. It should just be, this is the way we do it, end of story. So let's just all do the same thing so that we don't end up looking at different things all day. Cool. And so lastly, if the benevolent dictator for life is responsible for reviewing all code, then something has gone terribly wrong. This is something that's really important. I feel like a lot of teams fall in this pitfall of, hey, this guy is our backend lead, or this guy is our front end lead, so he has to look at every pull request. That's a very quick way of making that person really inefficient and just bogged down and not able to do anything else other than review code. So I think the ideal scenario is that, again, the style guide kind of permeates the culture of the folks reviewing the code, and that way anybody on the team can issue a style review to anybody else at any point in time and say, hey, you didn't follow the style guide in this particular case. So it doesn't necessarily need to be the one person or the committee that reviews everything. This is really important. Cool. So so what's the guiding light behind making decisions about the tech stack? So I think, a lot of people do ask, hey, okay, so now I know that, we want to have an architecture committee or a person that actually can make these decisions, but how do the decisions get made, right? Like, what's the best way to say to decide which component library to go with, or which pattern to use? And I think for me, the answer is simple: is just pick something and stick with it. This is more important than anything else, and the reason for that is that you follow principle number 2, which is that you have to be moderately boring, right? So you don't have to be extremely boring. So for example, you don't have to necessarily use tech that was used 25 years ago. If you don't want to, you can use stuff that is relatively new, but you also want to be moderately boring. And I think that if you're moderately boring, and by that I mean you pick things that are relatively stable, have been in the ecosystem for long enough to be battle tested, and also have a large enough developer mindshare that you could get help when you need it, then you are okay with pretty much any decision, right? Like, there's very little you could do to screw things up if you go with something that's tried and tested. So again, that goes back to principle number 1. So pick something and stick with it. I think if you follow these 2 things, you can almost never go wrong. So that's probably the most important slide in the whole in the whole deck. But now, I did say this was a talk called Opinionated React, so I'm just going to give you my opinions, and I'm going to go through a variety of things that we usually need to decide upon when we work on a React code base, and just tell you what I think. And again, just remember this previous slide, so you don't jump down my throat. Almost any decision is correct as long as you're moderately boring. So, but I'll give you my personal opinion on some of these things. So first of all, component types. I think a while back there was a debate about classes or functions. If I'm being completely honest, I feel like functions have won over classes in the React ecosystem pretty clearly, in terms of developer mindshare. Like, most developers these days are invested in functional components over class components. And in fact, I feel that almost every interview that I have sat on in the last probably year to 2 years. By that I don't mean that I'm being interviewed, but I've sat on an interview with a developer. A lot of folks in the room view class components as passe. So take that as you will. But I feel like there's a clear winner here. So if you're starting a new code base, or if you're thinking about creating consistency across your code base, I would probably go with a functional component approach over a class, which is also useful. I mean, it can be used pretty much in any particular case. There's, I think, a couple of edge cases where you need class components. Stuff like error boundaries perhaps is not available to functional components, but other than that, you can do almost anything. Directory structure, my main recommendation here is don't overthink it. Here, this is a link to the actual React docs that give them basic overview about some of the available features that they the exact same recommendation, which is don't overthink it. So I would actually follow their advice. I think this is really important. This is not one of the things that I would spend most of my time on. I would probably just pick one and stick with it. Now, in terms of what I like, I'll just add some opinions here. I'm not a huge fan of atomic design. Now, for anybody who's not familiar with atomic design, is the idea that your application has atoms, um, molecules, and organisms, and each of these is essentially um, kind of a different size of component based on how you look at it. So, for example, an atom would be something like a button. A organism might be something, or sorry, a molecule might be something like a card, which has a button and a few other things in it. And then an organism might be like a whole page. Now, the reason I'm not a huge fan of it is because I feel like there's no strict delineation between what different things are. And it's very easy to have a very blurred line of what is an atom versus a molecule, what's a molecule versus an organism, and it just gets really confusing. So for me, not my favorite. Again, pick one and stick with it. So that's the rule. um, so I like component subfolders. So for example, what you saw in the contribution guide that I showed for our component library, which is that under the components subfolder in a React project, you would create folders for each of the components that you're working on. So again, going back to the example of a button, the button would have a folder, and inside would be a button component, the tests for that button, potentially the styles for that button if you have separate style sheets, and all kind of in a single directory substructure. I'm not a huge fan of multiple layers of nesting. So I like the component subfolder, but I'm not a huge fan of when people start nesting in there 2 or 3 layers deep. I find that to be highly confusing and just very difficult it's very difficult to maintain the consistency of that. So when people start doing this, usually you'll end up with an application where a component folder will have one single layer of nesting, or another would have 2, and another would have 3, and then it just gets very muddled. So I'm not a huge fan of nesting beyond the typical, hey, this is my component folder, and that's about it. And then lastly, I like separating views and components, mostly because I like having a bird's eye view of kind of what the application actually feels like to the user. And I feel like views are the quickest way to do that. Views are really what the user is seeing, right? There's a login view and a sign up view, and there's a user's view and a dashboard view. And so to me, that's a very quick way to understand an application from a high level. So I like that. Linting. Just use Airbnb and don't think about it. So yeah, that's what I would recommend. Pretty much everywhere that I've worked, or any code base that I've worked on, either consulting, freelancing, or full-time employment, um, it has not been worth the time to create a custom configuration. So this is what I would recommend. In most cases, there are some minor modifications that folks may want to make, but start from here, and then maybe just add a few bits of customization if you really want them. Testing, I would really recommend just the standard library that's included with Create React App, which is just test runner plus React testing library. So you can use this to test pretty much any basic component functionality, like user interfacing with something, or data being rendered in the right way. And you can also use it to create snapshots. Now, personally, I don't like snapshots because I feel like they test implementation details. So I don't really do snapshots. So instead of snapshots, what I do recommend is to create visual tests using Storybook and Chromatic. For anybody who hasn't done this at all, Storybook is basically a way to write, well, they call them stories, but they're essentially renders saved, kind of like mocked renders of anything that you've built, or any component that you have. And then what Chromatic does is the Chromatic actually generates a snapshot of all of your stories, so that in the future, if you make a change, it'll alert you if something doesn't look right. Now, the difference between this type of snapshot and a traditional Jest React testing library kind of snapshot is that when you create a snapshot with Jest, it really is a kind of a DOM. It's just a JSON, like a DOM representation, right? So let's say that in the DOM I have a class called my user, and I change the actual class in a CSS file. There's no way for that snapshot to tell me that I screwed something up, because the class name is exactly the same, and I could have just completely destroyed the styles for it, and we would be none the wiser. Now, conversely, if you remove that class, let's say that was an empty class and you removed it from your markup, it really made no difference at all to your UI, but just going to scream at you because the snapshot doesn't match anymore because the class is not there anymore. So again, I think that something like Chromatic is a lot more useful in the sense that when you make a change, it actually tells you visually whether that affected the component or the view or whatever it is that you're rendering in the story. And it's very easy to mock data to recreate views in Storybook, and then just have Chromatic create snapshots for your entire application. So I like that a lot. Integration, I don't really like recommending stuff when I'm talking about React, because I feel like this is very context dependent, and by nature, integration and end-to-end really should include the entire stack. So we're not talking about the entire stack here. We're talking about React, so I'm not going to give any thoughts on this one. Routing, so similarly to linting, I would say just pick React Router and call it a day. There's a few other options, but honestly, nothing has as much mind share. And personally, I'll be honest, this is one example where earlier when I was saying, hey, not everybody has to like everything about the code base. Personally, React Router is not my favorite library to use. I kind of have a bit of a chip on my shoulder because every time they update, they change versions, the API is just drastically different. And when you maintain applications for more than a year, that's pretty impactful. So I haven't been a huge fan of them, but again, it's the largest by far, and at the end of the day, you just got to make a call and go with it. So that's what I recommend. One thing I would say here is, for me, I don't like having tons of individual route files. So for example, I've seen in a lot of code bases where folks would have like user routes and account routes and just all of these sprinkled all through the application. And React Router actually makes it really easy to do this, which is, I mean, that's kind of a cool thing that they're very flexible like that. But again, I feel like the routing is an area where I want to get a bird's eye view, and I want to know kind of what the application, I want to know the breadth of the application. So I think it's okay when things get really, really big to break things down in ways that make sense. But I'm not a huge fan of breaking, let's say, 2 or 3 routes here, 4 or 5 routes over here. I would rather have a complete context of the route of all of the views available in the application. Okay, next up, global state management. So first rule for me is decide why you need it, and that should inform how it's going to get used. If you don't know why you need it, then you probably don't need it. This is something I think a lot of people don't think about anymore. They just say, okay, well, we got to have Redux, or we got to have something for global state management. If you're not sure why you're doing that, then don't do it. If you don't know what to pick, but you really have a use case for a global state management library, then I would pick Redux and use Redux Toolkit. For anybody who's not familiar with Redux Toolkit, it's just an opinionated way to write Redux code. So essentially, it gives you utility functions where you can create stuff like slices and kind of reduce the boilerplate that's created by Redux, which is actually its number one complaint when working with it. So I would highly recommend that. And then part 2 for global state management is if you have lots of nested data structures, I really highly recommend normalizing. Personally, I'm a huge fan. I do understand that it can feel complex at first. Here is a guide that's from the actual Redux docs. So if anybody wants to check that out after the talk, please do that. I personally love normalizing. The reason I love normalizing is because if you stick to it and you're strict about it, then anytime you need to get data from the global store, the pattern's always the same, right? It's, hey, I want to get a user, so I'm going to go to users and then get that ID. So users bracket and the user ID. If I need to get documents, then I do documents bracket document ID. So everything is in a very shallow hash map with a normalized state, and there is just no confusion about what shape the data is in ever. Now there can be confusion about the actual objects that are included in a particular thing. So for example, unless you use TypeScript, where you have, let's say, a user object and you know what that has, you're not necessarily going to know what keys a user has in their object, but at the same time, you are going to know how to fetch any type of entity from your store from any given component at any time without having to think about the structure of your store ever again. So I highly recommend that. Okay, styles. So styles are interesting, and I feel that in React, styles are probably the number one turnoff for anybody who has never done React but has done web development. So people who are on the Jamstack who do HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and have come to the React world, I've noticed are very turned off by the lack of basically React's. For a long time, React didn't think of styles as a first-class citizen, and so you had to have all these loaders and figure out libraries to pair with it, and it was just kind of messy. So I think this is an important one. And typically what I recommend is if your team likes writing CSS, then just do that. React has a lot of ways to avoid writing CSS and still style your application. So if you want to do that, obviously go for it. But if your team likes writing CSS, then just do that. And these days it's relatively simple. So I think React has made it a lot better with the boilerplate in Create React App to just have styles be easily imported into apps. I'm mostly talking about a lot of years ago when that wasn't the case. If your team CSS skill set is lacking, so for example, if you have lots of people who are really strong on the JavaScript side of the front end, but they don't really know a lot of CSS. So let's address that in the next slide. So do you need a library? So this is probably what I would recommend. If the folks in your team aren't very strong with CSS, then don't have them write any kind of styling, whether it's CSS and JS or CSS or anything at all. Just use a library. So if you don't need custom components for React, then use Tailwind. Highly recommend Tailwind. Super easy to use and just makes beautiful applications right out of the box. So I love it. But if you prefer custom components, I think we're going to go back to our original principle. Pick one and stick with it. Any of the top players in the space will work just fine, and you can see, and they're pretty much all themable. I would say the hardest one, if I had to make a call, the hardest one if you want custom theming is probably something like Material UI. I mean, they have a lot of theming capabilities, but they also have very opinionated styles, and it looks a certain way. It very much looks a certain way. It looks like Material Design, no matter how you look at it. So that's a little difficult. Most other ones, so things like AntDesign, even the React Bootstrap libraries, are a lot easier to kind of make your own. So again, any one of those will do just fine, I think, for 99% of use cases. Don't create your own component library. So it's funny because I've created and maintained 2 component libraries for previous companies. So I feel like I'm the wrong person to be saying this, but the reason I say it is because I feel like most people don't have the use case. So and this is part of this slide, right? So if you're asking if you need a library because you're not really great at writing CSS, right? Then you shouldn't create your own. Now, if you're really good at writing CSS already and you need to create a library because your business has a specific need based on what you're building, then yeah, absolutely, that's the right way to go. But I feel like if you've made it to this slide and you have this question, do I need a library? Then you do not need to be creating a component library. Okay, so styles part 3. What about style components and CSS and JS? Obviously very popular right now. Some of our teams at Palmetto use style components to great effect, and they love them. And I've also worked in other code bases that use other kind of CSS and JS approaches. So for me, my recommendation is use it only if you have a lot of confidence in your ability to architect this thing, because I have seen in a few code bases already using styled components that it's very easy to create inconsistency everywhere you go, right? Because it's so easy. I mean, it's kind of a benefit, honestly, of these libraries, right? It's so easy to create styles, right? But at the same time, it's also very easy to just fall completely outside of any sort of constraints. which means that your application ends up being really, really inconsistent. So that's the one reason I'm not really into this idea, unless folks have like really strong grasp on architecture or CSS, right? And then what about CSS modules? It's a similar thing. I have used CSS modules. Our Palmetto component library uses CSS modules, so I like them a lot. I feel that they're used as a crutch a lot by teams because they don't want to think about the architecture at all. So CSS modules just takes care of making sure you have no class collisions and no classes overriding each other. And typically what ends up happening is people write custom classes everywhere, all over the place for anything that they need, and don't focus on making anything reusable at all. So I don't know, if you think about a class, it should be reusable. That's why it's a class. That's why it's not an inline style. So something to think about. Okay, so next up is forms. I'm going to keep this one short. I think you probably want to use Formic. There's other players in the space. There's Hookform, which I think is really good. I think there's a couple others, but I think you probably want to use Formic. So going back to our core concept, pick one and also be relatively boring. So I think Formic has been in the space longer than a few of these other players and has kind of a larger community around it. So I trust it a little bit more. I've also rolled my own form abstractions. I don't think this is the right approach for everybody, but I've actually found it to be pretty okay. There's a lot of things that I would not do myself because they're just highly complicated. So for example, I wouldn't create my own test runner. I just use Jest and call it a day. And I would not create my own React router. I also think that's kind of too much. Form validation and things of that nature, I feel like a little more shallow. So I feel like they're actually within people's grasp to create their own abstractions. But you also have to be familiar with what you're trying to do. So just kind of proceed with caution on that front. Data fetching. This is interesting because I think there's been a lot of changes in the space. The one recommendation I would have here is just abstract it into a service anywhere, whatever you're doing, because a lot of times I see folks making like fetch requests in a component, and that's just that I don't like that at all. I feel like it's really ripe for errors in code duplication, right? So like typing up an actual URL in a component that you're fetching data, not a good idea. So what do I actually recommend? I mean, again, I think that there's a lot of options here, and the most vanilla stuff is just, hey, just use fetch and create a service for it, or use Axios and create a service for it that you can use throughout your application. But I'm gonna go ahead and slightly break rule number 2, which is to be moderately boring, and I'm gonna say to try React Query. So it's a relatively new-ish library. I mean, maybe it's not that new. Maybe I'm not caught up on everything all the time, but it's a fantastic library, and it handles almost every use case that you could need for fetching asynchronous caching, is handled, and in most cases, by the way, you're not going to get out of me going through this documentation, so I'm just going to go back. In most cases, it can actually replace Redux for a lot of people. So it's a very good library. I would highly recommend it, or at least playing with it if you're considering a change from what you're currently doing. Cool, and that's it. Thanks for coming to my TED Talk. Does anybody have any questions? Good. I covered everything clearly because nobody has any questions.
Great talk, Juan. That was awesome. What is your thoughts with React and code reviews a little bit more? I know you talked about styles, but when you're talking about styles, are you talking about really enforcing some of the architectural guidelines and not just presentational styles?
Yeah, that's right. So sorry for that confusion there. So there are slides about styles that specifically are about styling the application itself, right? So CSS libraries, component libraries, etc. And at some point, I also talked about enforcing a style guide. So that's the code style guide that I was talking about. So in other words, how do we, how do we use Redux? How do we, how even our JSS syntax. So for example, how you even break down JSX, that can actually vary from team to team, how long your lines are, or how you break down the props on a large, component, or how you do ternary operators in React, or whether you use render functions to abstract things away, things like that. I think all of those things should be covered by a style guide, and it can seem daunting, but the truth is it usually comes naturally. Usually what I've seen happen is, um, you create a style guide that's very basic, and at some point somebody writes something that looks unfamiliar, and then the team kind of looks around and goes, hey, that looks unfamiliar. How do we want to do that from now on? Do we want to do this thing that this guy had just put in his PR, or do we want to do it differently? And it's just a quick kind of like, just a break, right? It's like everybody takes a break and goes, hey, yeah, I like it this way, I like it that way. And eventually, whoever's in charge can make a decision and say, hey, for this kind of thing, we're going to do it this way. And then that goes into the style guide. So eventually the style guide just becomes uh, a lot larger. It doesn't need to include everything right off the bat. So a good example, at my previous company, this happened a lot, and we had a lot. I mean, it happens probably every week where we have a use case where we're like, we're not 100% sure. This seems kind of new, and so you have to write new stuff. So a good example is, we were rolling out a new utility class system in our component library, and but I wanted to make sure that people weren't abusing it. So for example, I didn't want to see like 10 utility classes on an element. And so, we wrote a rule that said, hey, don't go over X amount of utility classes, because that probably means you want a custom class for this thing. And that's very highly subjective. So neither of those things is necessarily right or wrong. It was just what we wanted. So, and at the end of the day, it helps, because when you're writing code, you just know what to do, right? You say, I need to write a custom class for this. Let me go write it. Or I'm fine to use this other way, or things like that. But you never have to think about it.
Cool. And one more question from me is, I guess, the React ecosystem is very innovative and constantly changing. So as you have the BDFL on your teams, and I understand wanting to be boring and moderate, but as new things happen in React, do you guys have kind of a process you go through as far as like creating proof of concepts or prototypes, or how do you kind of address change in your scope?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, that'll really vary based on the team culture. I would say so, and it has varied for me as well in the different companies that I've worked at. But I can tell you something that I think works for me. So I definitely like this idea of the architecture meeting, right? And the idea being that when something new comes up, the main thing to remember is we don't have to change everything right now, right? So a good example for me was at my last company. We maintained a pretty large React application, and also the component library. And so I was quote unquote the BDFL for both of those things. And that was around the time that hooks came out. Actually, I think they've been out for 6 months maybe when we started looking at them. And we did have a lot of discussions around, because our entire at that time our entire code base, which I was not involved in writing necessarily, because I came in after a lot of it had been written. Our entire code base used the container pattern. I'm not sure if anybody here is familiar with the React container pattern, but for anybody who isn't, essentially separating the business logic element from the presentational element. And so typically the way that it's implemented is you have a class component that has all of the business logic. So for example, it would be called user list container, and then you have a user list component, and the only job of the user list is to take the props from the user list container and then render a bunch of markup. Um, so that, I mean, that's one example where it wasn't my favorite pattern, but I will say that we stuck to it, and it always felt familiar. Like when you go in a code base, you always know what to do. So for example, there's a lot of prop drilling that's involved with the container pattern, which can be annoying. We didn't like that, but at the same time, we never we never had an issue knowing what to do, right? Now, again, going back to the original question, that was around the time that hooks were kind of starting to get popular, and we did have to make decisions about how we were going to do things moving forward. So we found the best way to do that was essentially to Boy Scout, and slowly start moving the application to hooks. So by Boy Scouting, I mean making things better than when you left them or when you found them. Is that the right? Can't remember exactly what the phrase is, but essentially is if you touch something, leave it better than you found it. So we use that approach for refactoring and kind of moving to different patterns. So for example, if somebody was touching a view that had been previously done with the container architecture, then we expected them to move it to a potentially new architecture that we had already talked about this. We said, hey, this is going to be the new architecture moving forward. We want these things to be shaped this way, and this is how we do data fetching, and this is how we do loading states and all these other things, right? We didn't necessarily just say change it to hooks, right? So that's what we did, and there's also a lot of decisions that aren't as easily made. So for example, in some components it's really easy to do that, or in some views it's very easy to do that because they're not as complex or large, and there's others where it's really, really difficult. And so in those cases we just made judgment calls, and we say, hey, it's not worth the effort right now to move this to the new architecture. We'll slowly tackle the tech debt. So anyway, hopefully that answers the question.
Yeah, no, that was great. Any other questions? All right, well, I think we'll end that there. Any other comments or thoughts that the community would like to bring up? I do want to talk about in-person meetings. I'm kind of looking for maybe around July at the new Charleston Tech Center, but still just let me know. Let me know. I'm still trying to keep track, but that's what the CDC seems to be recommending now is July, August will be a good time to do a get together. So give me some feedback. Thanks again, Juan. This was awesome. And there's a lot of great value there. Thanks.
All
See
right.
you guys.
Thanks, everybody.
Have a great day.
Yeah, thank you. That's good.
Thank you.